kind of post DevCon stuff. What's going on in the space? What I had witnessed when I was there, what I had been taken part of, and then try to answer some questions. And then I might get into some architecture stuff because the space needs it, man. It really, really needs use case linkage, like real, no kidding architecture linkage. And I play this pivotal kind of, what can I talk about? What can I not talk about? What's a conflict based on what I do for work? As long as I'm not matching up my requirements that I work on, I should be able to give you guys some basic help and use case stuff architecturally. I can give you the ingredients and the recipe. The actual ability to do it's a whole other thing. That's also what I usually bring to the table for the stuff that I do for work, but the space needs it, man. The space needs the solution architecting side really bad from what I've seen out there. There's a lot of really smart people, a lot of smart developers, but it is a lot of, solutions looking for problems. And I gotta help. Gotta help it, bros. And this kind of conference, the ETH DevCon, the whole point of it isn't like, a shill fest or anything like that. It's an exact opposite, actually. There's no ICO talk. There's all the projects. So some of the projects that were present were ICOs, but they actually are trying to show where they're at in the product development. Meaning, like they had did an ICO, and they produced content, and they were showing that content and doing developer updates on that content. So, you had some initial what the point of it was, what they're creating, and then some initial examples of the content that they're building and it working on the network. But there's still this kind of gap of like, okay, I'm building a product and I'm getting it to function on this network, but like, who are my users and what problem am I trying to solve? And yeah, that's the kind of stuff I want to get into a little bit tonight that I had out there in ETH DevCon. Why it's foundational for people that are mining and anybody else that's participating in the network. Be that if you're purchasing a coin from a proof of stake standpoint, just look at the bottom line network. Like, what's the network effect? What's the value that they're trying to bring? And what use cases are they trying to tackle? Or are they just trying to disrupt in general and just they don't care and they're just running with what they're building and figure that if they build it, somebody will come. I think a lot of people kind of took, that approach on a lot of these different implementations that they're building and not really starting to try to look at how to link it up. And it could be for a whole range of reasons. One, probably people don't understand what the general requirement is for specific like enterprises. So if you're trying to disrupt that, you're taking on a lot, not just trying to replace the technology. You also got to get the customer base. You got to get the confidence in people to be able to use your network. You got to get the interfaces, the user adaption, the support structures that are there, all of these things. So that's kind of what I got up tonight is, since I'm not in my normal space to where I can, we can work on some hardware or take a look at some, other crypto networks, look at, the Ravencoin stuff with like some hardware or, check the 2080 Ti, that kind of stuff. I don't have any of that with me here on the road. So I'm trying to give you guys kind of some content that's hopefully I can, start a discussion architecturally with people, and bring it down to a level that's not so technical. So like people have different jobs throughout the whole entire world and they do different functions and they interact with systems every day. It doesn't matter what you do. I mean, you could be working at McDonald's to where you could be working in changing tires. It doesn't matter. Like your life has interaction with data systems in general. And some of the architecture that's being developed when it comes to these, not just cryptocurrencies, as things start to get out of that fiduciary, looking at just transfer of money and value, and you start talking like facilitating services or functions in society, that starts to intersect with all those other things, that not just a matter of transferring value or money. Did they talk much about the dollars from ETH, or was it more about that? Nobody talked really money. And this conference wasn't about the price. This conference wasn't about monetary policy as much. There was a few discussion points with acknowledgement that price matters to a point when it comes to the initial implementation of what ETH was, because if something's super expensive and costly, nobody's going to use it. So the concept of gas and gas cost and all that came up. Transaction costs, transaction volume, scaling, all those kind of discussions came up. But, from a miner standpoint, the only real miner discussion, from the people that mine the networks that came up really was around the prog proof of work discussion. And that was about a half-filled room. It didn't fill the room. The talk before, which was almost philosophical in nature, of trying to change mindsets and educate people. There was a session, so from scalability to inclusion, enabling mass adoption. And the basic premise of that one was, it's a lot of the discussions are very high level. It's saying, hey, we're aching for a change. We want automation, infrastructure, and acceptance of the change. We got to get buy-in and all this. And it's like all the basic stuff. Like, it's kind of like preaching to the choir. So a meeting like that was, like I sat in that room and I was like looking at everybody and I'm like, yeah, dude, of course. Like decentralization, distributing trust to the masses. I mean, you're preaching to the choir in that room. So maybe it was a practice run to try to get for a more group that wasn't looking for or had no idea what crypto was. But that room for a meeting like that was kind of like, yeah, we got it. The one after that was the EEA technical roadmap, which is the enterprise Ethereum, the group that sets down and tries to do exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to like storming and norming the requirements that are out there from an enterprise level, bring in the enterprise requirement to the Ethereum developers of saying, here's the things that I have to worry about on a day-to-day basis with my infrastructure or the databases and the workflow and the cadence that's associated with that. And then how would Ethereum or a platform that has to do with cryptocurrency address any of those issues? And that's part of the issues that are brought up, I would say, on crypto Twitter from specific people that really challenge the status quo of like, hey, we're going to change the world with this technology. And it's like, well, okay, cool. How? We all understand from the transfer of value without a third party, that's a breakthrough, right? That's what Bitcoin brought. It brought the ability not to have to ask a question to somebody. I can retain value. I can send value to somebody. That value changes because of a spot price, but there's no disputing that. We all know that's what the whole hoopla is about, right? But how do you take that value and switch it over to information? And then the properties that come in with that information, where does it make sense to hook up into like an enterprise if you're going to not use decentralization for that? What value is then brought forward? And that's kind of what I was kind of get through tonight, is I was being asked that question a lot too, of like, what value would a blockchain bring to an enterprise? And if you have to really look at it fundamentally of what's happening when you're putting information cryptographically into a blockchain and you have participants that sit around it. And in a public permissionless standpoint, anybody can come on, transfer with each other, and leave, enter and exit the network without any friction, right? It's just download something and I'm on. When you come to information, there's more of a purpose. Like if I'm exchanging information with somebody and then that information may lead to other components of information that will be part of it in a later time. So as I'm building an information set, it will have its history. It will have maybe more things that are added to it over time. And I'm trying to be very bland with it because I'm talking about it holistically in general, just a transfer of information over a period of time between multiple parties. You build that history. That's essentially what you're doing with a blockchain. You're building that history that is immutable, that does cross boundaries. And that was the kind of use case stuff that I was talking to folks about, of like, if I have 8 siloed systems in a canonical process, which means start to finish, and I layer a blockchain below that, what makes it effective is when you move it to where you're moving the governance of that process. So if I have here, I'm sitting here talking, and so if I have these entities that are different, we're going to just take beer as an example, and this is not a wholesaler, this would be right? So you got the basic supply chain. I'll use the supply chain, and I'll go through other stuff. Everybody likes to use supply chain because it's canonical. It has a flow. There's time that occurs on any one particular piece of those practices. So like, and I'm going to tie this in why this matters. Like I'm giving you guys like the structure of like a requirement. So a requirement would be like this stuff. The fact that things happen between these requirements would be like things that happen across this area. Then there's like a network. Let's just do this. Blockchain. We can say blockchain. Let's say crypto chain. I'm going to blow your minds for a second and say maybe that blockchain had some scalability or some side chaining ability right now, and you had an IPFS that's connected to that because I need somewhere to store things. And then, there we go. The barley farmer is kind of cut off right now with my head. All right, so what I'm saying here is like if you had a blockchain with these functions, okay, the mining is holding it up. The mining is just supporting the network. It's doing the validations. It's the consensus algorithm. It's running the consensus. The consensus algorithm there is proof of work. The crypto that it's part of is whatever, so if we're talking on this one would be Ethereum in this example without the IPFS. You could have an IPFS off to the side that you're making calls to and storing information that's relational to a connection a transaction that you're making here. So proof of work is just holding this up. It's stilting the network. That's the point of it. And we are paid as miners as part of this, holding this platform up. Developers will build above this line here. Let's get the blockchain. You get the file system. You're going to have, if somebody like copies this and turns it into a freaking ICO, I'm going to kill you guys. You guys be on the watch. And this isn't signifying that these will all be dApps to these individual processes. It's not like that. It's just saying that maybe one of these is the one, and that's if it's a dApp. Like this, part of this could be used as a dApp, a decentralized application that sits on this, and part of this is going to set in an infrastructure, potentially in an infrastructure that is, these are just different layers, right? You could have dApps. You could have ABCIs, which is application blockchain interface. Think of it like an API. There's blockchain oracles. These interact with the ability to take any of these core functions here, and like this guy's going to have inventory, pricing, databases, which is probably in some big CRM. Okay, so this area, I'll have like a CRM, which is a customer relations program, which have its customer base, inventory, and pricing. These guys will have these databases that kind of are siloed. Each of them have their own information. It's proprietary to them. They don't want anybody else seeing it. And they'll exchange some information back and forth to each other. They'll have their normal supply chain processes going back and forth. sending orders, buying stuff, all that kind of stuff. This may be super boring for you guys, but this is like Mr. Miyagi wax on, wax off stuff. It will come together, and I'm gonna tell the story of where this actually comes into it, because like some of the stuff I see on crypto Twitter from pretty intelligent people just have no idea when it comes to genuine like how to build systems. Like they understand how to build like a dApp, and they can build a cryptocurrency blockchain, but they have no idea on how the world really works, on interface agreements and what data goes between where, and why. It's pretty obvious that the fact of why they don't understand on how to put this together and what the real relation, because they haven't been responsible for architecture that's supposed to work and doesn't, and where these things become not just the thing keeps turning. I love this program, but it's real finicky. Like if you tilt it just a little bit, like. So you got this. Somebody's gonna copy this, and it's gonna get turned into a dApp. I just know it. All right. So where I'm getting to this is the world right now is you have a lot of this going on right now. This is the current as is state. Is these little guys right here. We're gonna color this yellow. We're gonna drop this to the back. So that wonderful little piece here is the crypto ecosystem right now. Proof of work mining, holding up base stuff, still doing proof of work or proof of storage, mining, IPFS networks, blockchains, dApps that are being created, right? Different types of dApps that do different things, low usage, trying to solve world hunger. You got all these different dApps, right, that do different things. And then you got some discussion here of these guys, ABCI, blockchain oracles, layer 2 solutions, development tools. So you got layer 2 solutions when it comes to scalability, and then you got kind of layer 2 or layer, I would call it Gen 2 solutions on the development tool side. So you got Gen 2 tools where you can start doing stuff like JavaScript, higher level languages. That's not like bytecode. It's not an EVM. So EVM is like an Ethereum virtual machine. It's not a lower level where you have to use Go, Solidity, very specialized applications to compile the bytecode, right? So you have next level up to where you can take more palatable development suites that have matured a little better and are able to then write your code in those. Those are coming along. So that just gives you the abilities to write in different interfaces and more where you sound code that you can then have multiple people that have Java experience be able to review. There's not just a ton of people that do C++ development and Go and Solidity that has been working in this space. There's more and more that are coming every day and learning. Hell, there was at least, I don't know what the total of at the DevCon was, but there were a metric crap ton of developers. But your typical development group, we're going to come back to this real quick. I'm going to give you a basic, for the folks that don't understand. Developers, you're going to find this boring, but essentially you have requirements from customers, which turn into epics, which are like big categorical things, stories, and task. There's another level between those sometimes. Depends on what group you're using, but you can use epics can go into use cases, and then use cases can go into stories. Everybody will pick this apart on however they do it, but essentially customer requirements comes into this layer. Then you have developers that sit. You have like architect level, architecture, model, and design people, and then you have database. I'm going to call this, and then you're going to have core developers that actually write the React front ends and write the Node.js back ends, and work with some kind of database architecture, I should say. So you got developers and testers. You got these people at these different levels. Okay, and so when you have a room full of developers and testers, the roles that process these requirements in this. Let me bring this up. So this is customer. You got a person. It's like a business dude that has a function. Business analyst. They move these tasks. They take like what the requirement is and they kind of break it down, and their outputs are going to be use cases, like how do I use it, what am I doing, what's the point of it, the who, what, when, where, how, and why of whatever function. Then you got RACI charge, which is responsible, accountable, consultant, informed. Like who cares about this stuff. Governance use cases will have like as is and to be. To the way this really goes here. I'm doing you guys a damn service, by the way, right now. All right. So these elements here. So there's a whole rhyme to why I'm doing this, because like I want to be able to refer back to it to like people that are trying to figure out what they're building and why they should care, because they're missing various components of this that they need to be able to put, and it's not like something you put in necessarily the white paper. It could be like what they're trying to answer, but it's like one of the frustration points of sitting down with developers for the past week that are building really interesting stuff, but are just missing the point on certain things. So the part of this output is the discovering the as is. Like what are you trying to replace right now when you're building this stuff? And it's not the superficial explanation of things. Like if you read any of the white papers, you look at 95% of the ICOs out there, they tell a story. They tell a basic story. Here's what our application is. Here's why it's decentralized. Here's what we're doing. Here's why you should buy into it. Here's the incentivization for it. All these cool things. However, and then they start building some stuff. They go straight from like requirements that they think, and they go straight to development, right? Because they can quickly leverage the architecture here in the middle that's being provided by the platform, which would be like Ethereum, and they're already getting the data storage and schema baseline because I should be writing this down. Hold on, let's do as is, and to be come out of their actions. Use cases as is to be comes into. I'm just using one example. There's a lot more to this, but like this is like more than you guys are probably getting. Like if you guys went to a class on this, like you're getting a crunch course on the way this works. So that feeds in. There's a lot more. There's joint application development sessions. There's hierarchical group structure of what data people need to see and what people data don't need to see, like the difference between a supervisor and a worker, all that kind of stuff. There's a whole bunch more into what they do. But bottom line, those things fall into epics, which come into stories, which are smaller components. You can start to break things down into the larger components of whatever you're trying to replace, and then you get into the task level. Task level usually gets divvied out to each of these extra layers down here, and then developers take the task, complete the task out, and the series of them, they'll have enough components that they can have tested and then deploy in a minimally viable product. The things that I was saying here though is like the ICO world and the people that are building some of this stuff doing is that the relational piece here is the architecture is the crypto platform in this world. The default templated smart contract, they're inheriting essentially the architecture and the data schema for whatever they're trying to build from that would normally be in these two phases here. And then developers are then just building their dApp, and they're missing a couple big components of it. So their dApp may have a few requirements to them that they're trying to meet. They're inheriting a few requirements here, but they're not going through a lot of this model and designs, the kind of, you can do that iteratively architecture of like looking at, like there's chances that they'll have to interact with an actual system versus trying to be their own system of record, stuff like that, to where they're bypassing a lot of stuff, and then they're getting these like half-baked products that don't do a litany of things that they should do, They're very serial in nature and what they're providing in the decentralized app, and it's because what the target environment that they're trying to disrupt, they don't either fully understand all the requirements that are needed in a minimum set. So then when people go to start to use it, they're like, oh, this is cool, but it doesn't do all these things because they haven't went through some of this activity, because they're kind of just going with, they're trying to go straight into the disruption model. And there was I try to use an example when I was out there of like doing this world right now what we're all promoting and doing and being part of is great, but it's all like everybody's trying to be Uber. And what I mean by that is, if you look at this structure here where you have siloed systems, if you could take this, what Uber essentially did, and this is what a lot of the decentralized applications are trying to do, is if this was Chicago Taxi DB, the as is in the world before Uber, as is taxi public transportation. Like, you wanted to go anywhere, they all had their own rates, right? I'm not going to do all these, but rates, crappy service, right? They all had different rates. They all had different crappy service. They all had different numbers. Didn't have their own apps. And then Uber came along and effectively did, besides Uber's not decentralized, so you could go to any one of those locations and you're using just this one app, right? So you take it out of a siloed world where everything's individual, and then you go into singular. Here, there's not very. Airbnb was the same thing. Airbnb did the same exact thing that Uber did when it came to that kind of concept, right? For if you're trying to use a place like, if you want somewhere to stay in a city, right? You're seeing this also with like the scooters now coming around, public transportation in general. So you have this concept where you can be highly disruptive. You can build an app that transcends the norms and becomes the center point. Now, all of the revenue from said app is shared amongst the participants, right? The drivers get a portion of it, and then the company makes a ton of money. And then if company's public, then the stocks earn dividends and your stock price rises, right? What a lot of these dApps are trying to do is the same kind of thing, but like in entire industries, right? Like, we're going to revolutionize the way supply chain requirements work, right? Supply chain requirements, right? One dApp with one blockchain with maybe an IPFS, which would be required in that, would want to do replace all of that, right? And the problem is that is much more intricate than somebody come and pick up a car, you picking you up in a car, or if you're just staying at somebody's house. So that's the first problem. Second problem is you have to look at the way processes work. Like, what's the process? What's the breakthrough that has to happen in the world of like something like Uber? It was just the acceptance that people would use a tool and then get into a car with somebody that wasn't behind an entity. Like, there wasn't like an entity locally. And what it came down to is it didn't matter. That didn't matter to people. People are like, I get into a taxi, I'm with a stranger too. So what's it matter if it's a car that's both of them are strangers in a car. So that wasn't the huge breakthrough. It was just the acceptance that you could believe in the app and that it was consistent, and all the UX and all the other things that were good with it were good. The reason why I keep using the Uber thing is because a lot of these apps are trying to, without them knowing, when I was sitting there at ETH DevCon and I was listening to their presentation of what their targets were and what what their development and scaling and everything that they were putting into their updates and everything, and then what their target audience was. A lot of it sounded and felt like, I'm going to disrupt this industry, and this is the tool that's going to be done with it. But the problem is most of this stuff is either very detailed, where you're going to have to do a little more peeling back and start. I'm not saying that they can't do it, and they absolutely can. Certain things have to change, though, including and not limited to working through some basic requirements process of the actual requirement types. Pick one company and work with one company to kind of build that out, right? They need to make a relational adaptation to existing requirements with like a single company, and pick one product line and just work through it. I mean, that's the thing you have to do, because there's so many different components in this. And this example here, where I'm talking the farmer, the grain store, the supplier, the distributor, the wholesaler, the retailer. I mean, any one of these particular components here, if you could extend, a blockchain solution to just get the transactional history between two of these different entities, and then it could link back to their existing databases, then you could build a portal outside of that. So let's say that this DApp ended up getting created between these 2 points, because right now this going back and forth here isn't just two entities. This action here from wholesaler to retailer could be, 10,000 retailers and 15 wholesalers, right? And if you're a product vendor, that's the owner of whatever this so like in this example here, you could say that this was Anheuser-Busch, or name any other, right? If this was InBev, they would care to see some of the facilitated process through this portal, essentially. And instead of trying to get the information from each database, if AB was above this, AB, we'll make the DApp color different. If AB is the one that cared about this, it'd be advantageous for them to then have these processes writing to a chain. Let's say they're doing a basic output and straight into the chain from a blockchain oracle. So an oracle is just writing this process to a chain. The information is still in here, and the information is still in here. So this is kind of a duplication of it, but there's a few big key points here. It is a duplication, but if you have everybody writing down that process, you've essentially created what's equivalent into a middleware right now. These things do not want to snap to this. Where you're dragging these down to a chain. You're taking key components of this to a chain. Maybe state change and transaction history, all that stuff's writing down, where they're going to keep all their core information in there into each of these different databases under each of the grain person, the supplier, the distributor. But if you have a key component, you got a lifecycle and a provenance of that information on chain. So it's a duplication. In this capacity, this becomes a BAM, a business activity monitor. That can then read back up to this DApp, right? And this DApp would give now new insights and awareness in a trust and immutable state, because while the main entity up here has individual relationships probably at a main wholesaler or a few retailers, because they have some kind of national retail sales division or something. All the various retailers in the country, they might not have direct relationships with. The wholesalers will have relationships with those retailers, but the top company won't. So that's the difference. That I try to have those conversations with developers out there that are materializing their product, and I would get a lot of the core understanding between the grain silo and their inventory, and that their blockchain DApp would do those functions, but they're missing the whole point up here. But this guy and maybe even this guy don't give a shit. They have a process that works, and that they kind of trust to each other. But the guy up here cares a lot about the entire supply chain. Customers sit outside of all of this, right? A customer will set in this capacity, will set out here, customer, and why they buy things from a retailer, the relationship is up here to the type of product, the branding, right? So it's kind of a fork of, you're picking up an AB product, and you may have bought it from a Phillips 66, but if that beer tastes like shit, you're talking to AB, right? So like having some holistic output of particular use cases, such as like provenance of the barley farm that phase of production came from, and then all of the different idiosyncrasies that it went through in that supply chain process, is one use case that could go into, that information gets written down as a business activity monitoring. And the reason why, like, a lot of people will probably counter this and say, hey, I could do that in a middleware. I'm going to tell you right now, as a solution architect and have built systems end to end like this, like, have no kidding, I've built almost 20, I built 25. I'm on my 26th system end to end. 8 of those I replaced. The other ones I built from a screen like this to where it was actually in production. And I'm going to tell you right now, the relationships, the interface agreements, and all of that stuff that we're talking about of trying to build a middleware across all those processes does not exist. It cannot exist because you have too many people, too many entities, and trying to sync all that data and all of their relationships is nearly impossible. You have to de-govern that process from like the AB owner down to a chain, and then everybody becomes participants on that. You've changed the governance of it, and that's the point, is saying you're going to subscribe to this because I need these 5 pieces of information, and I'm going to incentivize you guys to do that. And that's part of the other piece, is that whoever is setting this chain up, if it's a public chain and it's encrypted information that sits on that within an IPFS hash, however people have to build to make that come together. The point is that you can have you don't have to have everything on there. You're writing a few pieces of key information, very small transactions. I'm talking 4 data fields per, barley bag, right? So if there's 50 of them on a container, and I'm using this example as AB. I used to work for AB. So like I have a basic understanding on how this functions. And I have no conflict of interest of even talking about this components, because I don't work for them anymore. But what I'm saying is the fact that if you had where they are all subscribing to it, just components of that information and all making transactional history of that, you could then create that interface that shows the provenance of that to somebody like an AB that then could trace down from that customer call and say, hey, shit, man, this beer sucked. I don't know what's up with it. And you can trace that back through that process without having to go in and hit each one of these inventory pieces, the inventory and the pricing and the wholesaler. The wholesalers have something called a wholesaler routing system, route accounting system. The distributors, are like supply centers. Suppliers, maybe the can manufacturers, the water manufacturer. Right, for in the beer concept, it's all the different suppliers of the product. So if you have the printing of the cans, the metal of the containers, the water that's gone in it, the collection of all the grains and all the barley and all that, the rice and everything that's part of it, right? Those are the different suppliers, right? And then you got all the grain stores. So that's the midpoint once it's harvested, that kind of stuff. And then you go all the way down to the barley farmer. So like this is where all those have capital systems, what they call systems of record in there, like systems of record of the barley, systems of record where it got stored and when it got stored. If there's temperature, there's sensors, there's IoT devices, there's all this stuff, right? That's in capital systems that are in somebody's database, that's in their brick and mortar. And that's the point of trying to extend the tech to a point that you could start building apps to grab very specific state change information. And at that point, you have usage. And guess what? I told you I'd circle back to all of this. Is trying to, once you build at least the basis of that, even a notional one step that I'm just writing down from each process, right? Very limited amount of transactions, maybe keeping a copy of the invoice into a IPFS hash. And then if it's a proof of work mining network, we're just holding that up. And the miners are sitting down here, upholding this network because they had bought a mining box that's doing validations, confirming transactions, securing network. All right. Miners are down here at the very, very bottom, providing the security for the network, providing the consensus engine, the thing that matters of why you would use a blockchain for anything, right? Is the fact that it's reinforced. You know that as these transactions are writing down the series of the blockchain, time has occurred, information has been posted, new information's posted later on that was made up of the initial start hash from the previous block, right? You have this immutable ledger that's out there. You have reinforcement from people that are mining it. Those people are automatically compensated for being part of it, right? That's the way it works. I'm going to take some questions. I started built this whole thing. Let me zoom out a little. I don't know how that looks to you guys when I zoom out. Our little scratch pad tonight. So this is a cradle to grave application. No, this is an architecture overview. A cradle to grave application is a lot more deeper than this. This is just I was kind of venting tonight a little, just giving you guys some example of architecture and how things work. And like there's rational reasons to start the idea of implementing specific state information between the different participants. And you got to get that understanding of governance to where each one of those entities right now own their process and own their component of stuff. But if they release a portion of information related to, a product that they've just sold to the right of that process, and they've written that transaction state down to a blockchain, it's indisputable. That information's there. Now, people can put in bad information, right? There's garbage in. There's no known way to prevent that, right? But it's in there now. We're in a traditional database. If somebody writes in some bad data, they can go back in there and change it, right? You can update the record history. If I'm updating a record history on a blockchain, I've written a record. We find out later that, hey, it needs to be updated. It's making a new transaction later on, right? That refers back to the previous one and says, hey, that's there and that's history and that was a mistake, but here's the new one. There's no getting rid of it, right? It's evolution of it, right? It's a state change, but it's not, we're deleting the old one. I don't lose that governance. I don't lose that. So if you think of it in the most minuscule point, there's specific processes, and this gets back to that requirements refinement. There's certain processes in an entire life cycle of anything that you want to know. You want to know if something ever changed with it, right? I mean, think of all those different things that can affect people in different ways. And if you just had one piece of information, that matters. I've heard some really decent use cases. I brought one up to you guys a while back that I had heard about where one of the police agencies was just going to record anytime an officer had deholstered his weapon, right? And the only blockchain, I mean, it seemed like a gimmick in the beginning, but when you really think about that, if you have a public permissionless chain that's keeping track of, for a public servant and service person, the transparency that's brought forward if an officer deholsters his weapon, and it's just that event. It's like maybe an ID that's obfuscated of who the officer is. Just the fact that a weapon had been, deholstered. then you can have a corollary event of, and that information can be recorded, right? Because there's IoT devices that you can have that just monitor the fact that if it changes position in the holster, it unclicks and has that record gets written into a database that makes that write to the blockchain, right? And yes, so can somebody intercede and change it because it's going from a IoT device and then writing a blockchain transaction? Absolutely. You can have bad data in there. And then you can go back and see that, hey, there was somebody that accessed it. Somebody had made a change to it. It was an unauthorized user, right? I mean, there's ways that you can capture that. But the point of it is, and that would happen in a centralized system, right? So part of the argument's been, well, why is that any better? Well, it's better because it doesn't get lost in a traditional system. It goes into a database and then people can purge it, right? Like, oh, that had bad data in it anyways, we got rid of it. I mean, there's logs that get lost. There's all kinds of crap that happens, right? Being able to write specific events and then be able to scrutinize those events because they've been written in there is a whole different level of transparency and a whole different level of control, and it changes the behavior of certain things. So if you just had that one record, right, that has 4 data elements in it, you could then start to show like, hey, this actually occurred, right? And there's specific events that you could start to write in there. They're very small. It doesn't have to be the entire end-to-end process with the front end and the back end and all the business logic and all that. Some of it's just an initial step forward. Let's do that in the first requirement. Let's see how that works. Let's get that working. Let's get those data front ends up for people can see them and see the immutable fact that certain things occurred, right? We're seeing the application you'll use right now with people that have built decentralized applications to capture Twitter comments, right? It's just an empirical right that it's like somebody can go back in and delete a Twitter comment right now, right? Well, there's bots out there that just parse all that and put it right into the Internet Archive equivalent, right? But it's writing it to a blockchain, right? So that's out there. It's out there forever, right? Because it's history. The point of it is that we got to learn. We got to learn from mistakes. You know, there was a really good saying that I think it was Denzel Washington that said it in one of his speeches. He's like, you know, you fall 7 times, make sure you get back up the 8th, right? Like, we're going to fail at the architecture side of this for a while and continue to punch through it and figure out what makes sense. But the whole point of it is that I don't want to have to trust to transact, right? So if all these entities are right now living, breathing, facilitating functions and posting information, and if we can do that in a way that we can start to trust the data, that the fact that the data got into the database or into the blockchain and that it was a transaction and we have some provenance of that, we'll start to understand who is bad, doing the bad behavior, putting in incorrect information, and always having to correct it until things start to get right. And then things start to function and automate. And then you can start to give up some of the business logic layers into smart contracts as those start to evolve. And then things start becoming automatic and consistent. Right? You have redundancy because the difference on that side is the smart contract is running on the platform, right? So it's not just one entity. Like, where if the business logic in the grain store, in this example here, if the business logic in the grain store went down and it wasn't able to send its inventory and pricing to the supplier, this kind of crap happens all the time, right? Or if it's just making that connection to the key information into the blockchain's being held up by that whole entire infrastructure. You have redundancy there, right? So you're not relied on just that one issue or that one event, right? And if it is down, you have empirical evidence that it's been down because it wasn't writing out to the chain. I mean, there's a lot of different use cases. So that's what keep going. That's why I started creating this other one here of letting you guys understand the requirements, where things are at in the space, architecture, how things functions and work. And a lot of this seems to be the crypto platform, smart contract, and let's build a DApp, and not so much of refinement of requirement, working through a business analyst, building out some use cases, who's responsible, accountable, consultant, informed, who's the governance of it, what's the as is, what's the to be, What's the root cause analysis that you're doing? How does that link? What's the story? What's the process? All that kind of stuff. Things that, some of those discussions I had at the ETH DevCon were really good developers, smart guys, but just didn't have the big picture in any capacity, right? When I started drilling into like how they were going to answer certain things and given some options and ideas, it just was blank stares. Like, whoa, never thought about that part, So I'm very bullish on the space because the tech is sound. But there's still huge amounts of gaps that need to be fixed. There's attack surface things when it comes to proof of stake. There's obvious issues on if you're trying to scale it because you want to do high transactions. There's still some gaps there. I'm looking at it right now, what's available. Like what's the as is right now that's available to write that works. We have a couple use cases out there that show that the tech works. But it's a limited use cases. I mean, we all know CryptoKitties works. It slowed down the network, but damn, I log in every time my CryptoKitties there, right? And it's the same one, right? And it's mine. It's tied to my private key. I know. So we're seeing things that are functionally working, right? It's just now how do we apply those use cases in the real world and give it that makes sense, That's because they will never be involved in the real world experience with it. So I think the people that I talked to, Sean, seemed a lot of them came from either the financial sector, brokerages, high performance trading people. A lot of the when I say the word fiduciary, a lot of the things that have to do with money, capital, asset movement, digital asset movement. A lot of people in that space, which work in that kind of ether of information and financial sharing. But those models are very linear. They're infinitely complex when it comes to business rules, like what they have to report and what they have to adhere to from a law standpoint. But like when you look at the data architecture of that, very dimensional. Exchange is a little different. There's a lot more architecture. Immensely a lot more architecture on an exchange standpoint, but that are just facilitating transaction changes. And mind you, a lot of this infrastructure, guys, is a lot of copy and paste. There was a great report that I sent out a few days ago, right when I got back from Prague, that showed like something crazy, like 80% of all the smart contracts that are written out there right now, sitting on this, I think this was Ethereum, are essentially the same amount of code, just some bytes flipped, right? So like from the development of this layer here, so you get the crypto platform and the smart contract layer, they're inheriting a lot of the core smart contract language that's out there. So there's not a lot of innovation when it comes to facilitating other new business requirements or any of that. It's a lot of the same kind of. It reminds me of some of you guys are as old as me. So when you start talking like the old video games, you had like so many like Nintendo games as an example. Like you had the side scrollers, you had and a lot of side scrollers. River City Ransom, Castlevania, all that kind of stuff. It was all essentially the same function, and it was just reskinned and had different data elements. And then you had some that were like background, and then there was just a very basic function, kind of like I don't want to say Pong, but just very basic single screen, and just did joystick controls functions, Gauntlet, the top-down stuff, right? Missile Command, all those kind of different games that were very just static. They didn't have a lot of things, and there was just one series of thing that kept doing stuff. So like you had these categories, you put those into categories, right? So you have like side scroller category. You'd have maybe a baseball game, football that was kind of, they're all the same kind of scrolling kind of thing. They were just retagged differently. So you had about 4 to 5 main categories of types of game. There's like the same thing with smart contracts. You have some very basic contracts, an ERC20, which spins up new tokens. You have essentially DAOs. You have a few core functional smart contracts out there, and then huge amounts of duplication of it. You have, the random seed stuff when it comes to like gambling and a lot of gambling apps. Same thing with smartphones. Smartphones are the same thing. You download all these different smartphone games. They're all the same damn thing. They're just reports of each other with because people are using templates. Somebody went through a lot of pains and effort to create a basic spec, and they built out a functional end-to-end product, and then people just reskin it. So a lot of that kind of stuff is what's right now going on in the DApp world. And so they're not answering the hard part because they have to work with a customer, to like build the business logic, write the smart contract that does specific functions for that, not to just wholesale replace it. Like if you think of, like on a cloud deployment, you have essentially a lift and shift. I'm just taking what you have and I'm moving it to a new platform. Or you have some refactoring. I'm going to kind of do what you're doing now, but I'm going to change my business logic layer to be a smart contract versus being a database. That's kind of the stage we're in right now. People don't want to lift and shift, and it doesn't make sense to because blockchains are slow on the data side. You don't want to lift and shift ever. Like if anybody's telling you, hey, we're just going to take this application and put it on blockchain, run, right? That's not the way things work. If you want to do a partial where you're doing some rework and you're taking a component of that, I would probably still say probably don't do that because the rest of your app's probably going to be super slow and it's not going to work right. The model I was just talking about through this other process was don't change anything on the app side yet, but capture certain activity out of the apps from the multiple participants, right? So not just in your office, but the people you interact with and then the downstream. Like everybody writes to the chain their component, their specific sets of information. Now that turns things into something called a business process or a business a BAM, a business activity monitor. So it's activity monitoring a life cycle of something, right? And it's crossing a domain for everybody. That seems the most palatable approach right now because you're not changing huge amounts of process yet until we understand the processes, because we have to go through this activity somewhat to understand it. Now, I'm not saying this is a typical like waterfall approach to understand it, but you got to know what you're doing in a basic standpoint and then come through iteratively and build it. Your agile part of development is here. Your discovery phase here is up here. And a very basic high level of that is doing just these top processes, bros. I mean, you could do a Demetti process, which is define, measure, explore, develop, implement. Implement this process. And you don't have to do this, but this is just a way, as an approach, right? Demetti, DMEDI, right? So define what you're doing. Like the white papers have been trying to do that, right? White papers. Measure means like have some empirical evidence of what you're doing. They're skipping this phase, bros. I've said that I've defined it. I'm defined my scope. This is what the DApp is going to do. This is the industry I'm disrupting. Then give me some empirical evidence of why and what you're going to do. What's the evidence, right? And this isn't always right. I mean, this is like capturing data and just saying, so like I'll give you an example. Like if you're going to replace a ticketing system or something, or a travel system or something, you're gonna what are you trying to do? The measure phase does like, I'm gonna reduce cycle time. I'm gonna make things faster for people, right? I'm gonna change part of the process, and that's gonna have an effect of things. Like you've done define, so you have some basic understanding of what you're doing, and then you're measuring it, right? You're measuring the numbers. This is the numbers part of it, right? This is where all the big cool numbers go. I'm going to reduce things by 90%. I'm going to speed up things. I'm going to do this. It's going to make everything easier for people. Explore is essentially your mock. This is your model and design, right? This is your develop. This is what everybody's going straight. They're defining their white paper and they're going straight to development, right? Some of them do some model and design, but most of them are going straight into development. And they're just iteratively going to it. They're taking Agile to the 10th level, right? Like, I said what I'm going to do, and I'm just going to start implementing it, right? Or start developing it. And then implement is like, you're in production. Implement's that phase where this is where you're getting a customer that has acceptance. Somebody's gonna use it. There we go. That acceptance, right? That's what you're trying to get to. And then, you have this process that kind of repeats over and over and over after implement. When you're in like sustainment, you're going to keep updating it and stuff like that. But this is effectively it. So we're getting this kind of a partial version of this with ICOs, and we're getting some of this. That's about. I mean, like. Measure may be part of some of them. Some of the effects come from measure. Like this is like root causal analysis and cycle time reductions, and they would do things in here called critical qualities. Like what is the critical things to improve the quality that I need to do? Stuff like that. Oh man, dude, I must be boring you guys, man. This is just basic process. So I'm just gonna be kind of more venting. And I know you guys are like miners and probably don't give a crap about this stuff, but this is kind of like just where the place needs to go to give value to this ecosystem that supports the actions that we're doing, which is down here. The miners are doing their job. They're holding the network up. Core developers are implementing functions and features on a blockchain. That's what the core developers do. That's what the Ethereum guys are doing. They're doing things like EWASM. It's like the evolution of what the Ethereum virtual machine is, by example. They're doing sharding, which gives you faster, it gives you a ability to create multiple instances of chains and have linkage and be able to have higher throughput and only need partitions. That's a little weird. The innovation that comes with the blockchain development. And then you have dApp developers, which are the essential ecosystem that is creating ICOs and creating dApps and trying to create stuff. So it's this space here that's the real lacking need, is this purple level, which is the integration points to get the real world stuff that these dApps say that they're going to try to disrupt, or that they're trying to compete with, or they're trying to become part of. That's the stuff that's lacking. I'm going to have to clean this document up and make a post of it.